When I do these talks, the first thing I do is give you a summary of the play. And then I give you historical background, and I give you themes and tell you stuff to look for. Today I'm going to do a little differently. I'm going to start with the history. I want to talk about the character, Emilia Bassano, who is at the heart of the Dark Lady. Talk about her fascinating life. Then go to the play. Then go to this whole question of Shakespeare's sonnets, because I never get a chance to talk about the sonnets. And we're going to end with some cutting-edge scholarship. So, Emilia Bassano. If you look her up in literary works, she's usually listed as Emilia Lanier, her married name, and the name under which she published. So we'll call her Bassano. Born in 1569, so she's 5 years younger than William Shakespeare. She's born in London. Her father, Baptiste Bassano, was a musician in the court of Elizabeth I. He was born in Venice. Let's think about this for a minute. 16th century, London, walled city, famous for plagues, disease, dirt. Venice. Why would you, okay. A whole bunch of Venetian musicians somehow end up in the court of Elizabeth, including Baptiste's relatives, playing away. So Emilia was Italian, but she was born in London. There is a possibility that the Bassano family was originally North African, so North Africa, Italy to England, in which case she might be black, or at least brown, okay? There is no absolute proof of this. There were black people in Elizabethan England. There was a black musician in the court of Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, a trumpet player called John Blank. But no one mentions that she was black. And the one portrait we have, which might be her, is of a white woman with dark curly hair. The only physical description we have of Emilia Bassano comes from the astrologer Simon Forman, and this is all he writes about her. She hath a wart or mole in the pit of the throat. Thank you, Dr. Forman. So we don't know. There is also circumstantial evidence, very circumstantial evidence, that the family was originally Jewish. So North Africa might make a certain sort of sense. If that is so, then they converted. Emilia was baptized in London. There were very few Jewish people in London. Jews had been banned from England in 1290. So the only Jewish families were converted. They were called Marranos. The most famous Marrano was Queen Elizabeth I's doctor, a Dr. Lopez. And when it was thought that he had poisoned Elizabeth and he was put on trial, one of the first things that was brought up was, oh, you were really a Jew. You didn't really convert. So it was dangerous to be a Jew in Elizabethan England. So they would have converted. Anyway, it's circumstantial. After her father dies, she moves in with Susan Bertie, Countess of Kent, and then the Countess of Cumberland. An amazing stroke of luck, which is talked about in the play, because this countess believed, bizarrely, in educating women. So she educated Emilia. Emilia learned to read, to write. She learned Latin. She learned some Greek. As we find out in the play, she knew 6 languages. She learned to play musical instruments. So she was incredibly lucky to have this sponsor early in her life. Doesn't matter, though, if you're educated as a woman in this period, you need to support yourself somehow. So she became the mistress of a man called Henry Carey, the Baron of Hudson, cousin of Queen Elizabeth I, who was 45 years older than her. I think we can all agree, ew. But it seems to have been a good deal. She seems to have been happy. She was kept very well. dressed well, kept well, and she could pursue her academic interests until she got pregnant at 23. And at 23, she had to be married off. And she married her first cousin once removed, again, first cousin, a man called Alfonso Lanier, another musician. And she gave birth to a boy called Henry, who would go on to be a musician. Incredibly musical family. Then, in 1598, she gave birth to a baby girl called Odilia, but that baby only lived for 10 months. And the rate of child mortality in the 16th century was incredibly high, so this is not surprising at all. Then the big event, 1611, she publishes a book. It's called Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, or Hail God, King of the Jews. She was 42 years old. And people now look on it as a piece of proto-feminist writing. And what she did was she looked at the role of women in the Bible. All these sort of Pilate's wife, people like that, Eve, and explained, how important and significant they were. She also dedicated the book to a series of powerful women looking for a patron. So I'll give you an example here. One of the people she dedicates the book to is Queen Anne. So we're now in the reign of James I. Anne is James I's wife, Queen Anne. And it says this: "Renowned Empress and Great Britain's Queen, most gracious mother of succeeding kings, vouchsafe to view that which is seldom seen, a woman's writing of divinest things. Read it, fair queen, though it defective be, your excellence can grace both it and me." Grace, of course, means I'd like some money. And this is what patronage was. You didn't make money from royalties and books in this time, especially a book of poetry. So what you would do is you dedicate it to a rich person, a nobleman, and hope that that person would then be so complimented, so flattered, that they would give you a stipend so you could go write another book. So that's what she was trying to do with women. It didn't work. Husband dies in 1613. So she sets up a school for girls. There's a radical idea. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. She gets arrested for running into debt. Eventually, she gets out, and then she has some sort of pension that keeps her alive. She moves to be close to her son, Henry, and she makes it to the ripe old age of 76. So a fascinating, fascinating life. And she's forgotten for centuries, but she's emerged in the late 20th century and the 21st century as this sort of feminist icon. There's a critic called John Hudson who suggested in 2008 that not only was she this feminist icon, she is the real William Shakespeare. She wrote the plays and the poems. Which brings us to the play, The Dark Lady by Jessica B. Hill. Jessica Hill is an actor. She's been performing for 8 years at Stratford, Ontario. She has starred in many of the best roles in Shakespeare and other plays. This is her first play, and it's been a huge success. It's had 4 productions already. It's winning awards. She's written another play. She's stunningly attractive, and it makes me just want to get a petition to ban multi-talented, beautiful people, because it makes the rest of us look so bad. Anyway, she tells the story that during COVID, she started reading Shakespeare's sonnets. She hadn't read them all in a row, so she starts reading them. And she gets to the so-called Dark Lady sonnets, which we'll talk about later. She then also gets a biography of Emilia Bassano and says, oh my God, look at this, look at the parallels. She reads Bassano's poetry and says, oh, I see parallels here and here. And she writes this play. And the first production in 2023 was in Winnipeg. Winnipeg's equivalent of Bard is called Shakespeare in the Ruins. And that first production was directed by Rodrigo Belfus. So the play itself, only 2 characters. It's a two-hander. we use that phrase to talk about these type of plays. It's a specific subgenre of drama. Plays like Oleana by David Mamet and Zeus Story by Albee, the two-hander, just two characters. Intense. And she does something interesting. She doesn't try to use Elizabethan language. She's not afraid of anachronisms. In the very first lines of the play, someone mentions playing a piano. No pianos in Elizabethan England. Jessica Hill doesn't care. That's not what's important. She modernizes it so that we focus not on the history, those details, but on the characters and their struggles. We then get a series of scenes, a series of vignettes, each with a different musical theme, which is specified in the script. And we get these scenes, encounters between Shakespeare and Emilia, and then these scenes with just Emilia, and they cover 30 years, right, up to Shakespeare's death, from their first meeting to Shakespeare's death. And the first time they meet, and they sort of sparring with each other, Bassano says, oh, you're Shakespeare, yeah, your plays, well, you're shit at writing women. And Shakespeare's like, well, take it easy. No, she says, no, you don't know how to write women. And eventually, they sort of get into this sort of collaboration. Shakespeare basically says, okay, well, help me fix this. How do I do this better? Shakespeare says, I'm serious, collaborate with me. I think I need your mind. And Emilia's overjoyed. You want me to? Absolutely, absolutely, right? We're going to make something of substance and something that represents women in a way that hasn't been done before. Eventually, this collaboration becomes something else. They become lovers. And there's this great scene in the play where there's some erotic cross-dressing involved. Let's just leave it that way. And they become lovers. In this version of the story that Jessica Hill is telling, Odilia, that baby girl, is Shakespeare's. Not historically true, but there we go. They keep working together. She can see through Shakespeare. She takes him down a peg again and again and again. Shakespeare, in his sonnets, has all these poems dedicated to the fair youth, the young man. Who is this young man? Well, Shakespeare says, no names, keep it anonymous so people can focus on the work. And Emilia says, Henry Worslinging, Earl of Southampton. Shakespeare, how did you, what? You just saw right through me. You got it in a minute. So she deflates Shakespeare. Eventually, you can't tell them apart. They sort of blend. We get this scene where they're talking about lines in a play. At one point, Shakespeare is quoting Emilia and says, you wrote, for well we know this world is but a stage where all do play their parts and must be gone. A bit derivative. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. Emilia says, I came up with that. No, I'm pretty sure I did. No, I'm pretty sure it was me. So they begin to blend into this creative unit until, of course, finally Shakespeare passes. He dies, and in the last sort of very touching scene, Emilia goes to his grave. And I think this play is beautifully written. It's one of the best modern plays I've read in a long time. It is not, however, historically accurate. Big stuff is made about the fact that Elizabeth Bassano is the first published female poet in the English tradition. No. Elizabeth Whitney published a book under her own name in 1567, 35 years before Bassano's book came out. It was a collection of poetry called The Copy of a Letter Lately Written in Meter by a Young Gentlewoman to Her Unconstant Lover. Great title. not finished, with an admonition to all young women and to all other maids in general to beware of men's flattery. So Bassano was not the first published female poet. And there are some other things in the play. Shakespeare was not the father of the daughter. In the play, Shakespeare bails Emilia out of jail after she's arrested. That didn't happen, but hey, who cares, all right? Shakespeare did a lot of things with his history too. So let's now pull back and talk about this whole dark lady thing. What is this about? And we have to sort of go back to the 19th century. So in the 19th century, as I've talked about in other speeches, that was when Shakespeare was held up as the ultimate universal genius. The British were just exporting him around the world. He was incredibly popular. The vast majority of plays being put on were Shakespeare plays. You know, there were cowboys in the Wild West who carried the complete works of Shakespeare with them. Shakespeare was everything. And the critics and the fans were desperate to find the real Shakespeare. He's got all these brilliant characters, but who's the real Shakespeare? Who's the man? What did he really think? And you will read these books, especially in the 19th century, where critics will point out, see this, the last speech of Prospero in The Tempest. That's Shakespeare's real voice. That's Shakespeare speaking. Yeah, really? Maybe not. The other place to look, of course, was the sonnets, because the sonnets feel confessionable. They feel like someone just thinking aloud in a structured way. And therefore, to get to his emotional life, we have to go through the sonnets. And there was a tradition of thinking of sonnet sequences as being autobiographical. And this takes us back to something I've mentioned a couple of times, especially when talking about Romeo and Juliet. Petrarch, Francesca Petrarca, the Italian who is basically thought to have started the Renaissance. In April of 1327, this young man who is intending to be a priest goes into a church in Avignon, sees a beautiful woman named Laura, falls madly in love with her, can never have her. She's above his station, she's married. But he goes off and writes about being tortured by his love. He writes not in Latin, but in Italian. He uses serious language, not the bawdy language of ballads, but serious, often religious language to talk about his devotion to this woman in a series of small poems that were called originally Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta, fragments of vernacular manners, but later be known as the Rima Sparsa, the small poems. And profoundly influential piece of literature. People start to copy this everywhere. The most obvious example is Romeo and Juliet. At one point, Romeo's friend Mercutio even says he's in Petrarch's line. He's pretending to be Petrarch. And what Romeo does is he takes the cliches, what became cliches from Petrarch, and uses them in a stupid way. So in Petrarch, there are a lot of oxymorons because he desires this woman, but he's frozen out, frozen fire. Right? Bad poets like Romeo just grab, oxymorons, when we get two completely different words and push them together. Examples? Oxymorons? Military intelligence. A classic. Others? Jumbo shrimp, good one. Other ones? Zoom meeting. American beer. So that's one tradition that gets picked up from Petrarch. There's another tradition, which will be important to a poem that shows up in the play, called the blazon tradition. The French word blazon, which originally referred to heraldry, descriptions of heralds, coats of arms, but in Petrarch's poetry was used to describe women. So what would happen is a woman would be described her physical attributes by comparison to inanimate objects, usually starting at the top of the head and going down to the feet. Her hair is like golden wire. Her eyes are as blue as the sky. Her teeth are like pearls. Her lips are as red as coral, all the way down, right? The Blazon tradition. And this becomes a cliche too. Now the sonnets, they start in Italy, they spread through France, and they show up in England during the court of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was desperate for the English court to be as sophisticated as the French and Italian court. England was behind the eight ball. The Renaissance started way before, a century or so in Italy before it got to England, because England spent the 15th century fighting, civil war, the War of the Roses. When the Tudors came to the throne in 1485, things calmed down. When Henry VIII comes to the throne, he's like, okay, now's the time. I want art. He brings in artists. I want musicians. Brings in musicians. And I want poetry. And so all the courtiers around him say, oh, geez, the boss wants poetry. That Petrarch guy, those poems are short. We can do those. And so you get guys like Wyatt and Surrey. First thing they do, translate Petrarch. Right? Hey, boss, look at this. I'll whip this off. Stole it, right? Then other people begin to do it. And there are so many sonnets written in this period. I once read an estimate that said there was something like 100,000 sonnets written in the 16th century. I don't know if that's true. It feels true. And the vast majority of them are terrible. There are some good ones. Edmund Spenser writes a sonnet sequence called the Amoretti, which has some beautiful sonnets. Sir Philip Sidney writes a sequence called Astrophyll and Stella, beautiful poems. But what they all have in common is basically, here, what's the quote here? Worshipful love for an almost goddess-like yet unattainable female love object. There she is, I can't get to her, I burn, I swoon, etc., etc. And then we get Shakespeare's sonnets. Shakespeare's sonnets, 154 sonnets, are published in 1609. The vogue for sonnets was almost over by that time, so these are a little bit out of date. They're published in a quarto. And he did something brilliant. That whole tradition of, I pine for this woman, I pine for this woman, he flipped it on its head. What if I don't write my poems about this woman? What if I write them to a man, a friend? Then I can talk about things that no one else has addressed in the sonnets. I can talk about jealousy. I can talk about rage. I can talk about despair. I can talk about all these other emotions that weren't possible with that Petrarchan model. There are 126 sonnets addressed to a young man, who critics call the fair youth, and the last 28 are either addressed to or refer to a woman called the Dark Lady, because she's described as having black, wiry hair and dark dun, that means brownish colored skin. Shakespeare has this one sonnet, which is very famous and is quoted in the play, but people get it wrong. They think it's a delicious love poem. It's not. It's an attack on what the other poets have been doing, on the Blazon tradition. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral, far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses, damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare. It's that little ending. See, it's an attack on the other poets. Shut up with those comparisons. I don't want to hear it anymore. She's not like any of those things. She's better because she's herself. Right? So it's an attack on that tradition, that cliche. Now, not all the sonnets are like that. Some of them, just give you a little bit of Sonnet 151, do seem to indicate that there was some sort of relationship between Shakespeare and this lady, which was, what's the word I'll use? Restricted. Parental guidance needed. So, for example, in Sonnet 151, it's talking about his love. And it says, "For thou betraying me, I do betray my nobler part to my gross body's treason." That is, okay, sometimes you betray me, but sometimes my body betrays me. "My soul doth tell my body that he may triumph in love. Flesh stays no farther reason, but rising at thy name doth point out thee as his triumphant prize. Proud of his pride, he is contented thy poor drudge to be, to stand in thy affairs, fall by thy side." Do I have to explain that? So, critics, like I say, who are desperate to find biographical information about Shakespeare, but find out anything about his inner emotional life, have torn these poems apart again and again and again. And they have looked, who is the fair youth? Is that homoerotic or not? Who is this dark lady? And there have, somewhere I've got a list of something like 8 names of people who have been suggested. Here we go. Elizabeth Vernon, Penelope Rich, Aline Florio, Mary Frinton, Mary Mountjoy, Jane Davenant, Jacqueline Field, Lucy Black Morgan, Winifred Burbage, and of course Emilia Bassano. So there's just been this sort of feeding frenzy. We got to find out what's going on with Shakespeare. Here's the trick, though. Petrarch changed his life when he saw Laura, wrote all these poems of love. There are a lot of critics that now believe there was no Laura. It's all an artistic pretense. It's a fiction on which he can hang his poetry. Might be true also of Shakespeare's sonnets. Maybe there isn't a dark lady. Maybe there isn't a fair youth. We don't know. To the cutting-edge scholarship. There's this assumption about Shakespeare, a biographical assumption that emerged in the 19th century. It goes like this. Shakespeare, a young man in Stratford-upon-Avon, gets Anne Hathaway pregnant. Anne Hathaway is 8 years his senior. They wanted a formal wedding, so they painted the shotgun white. Trapped in this marriage with this older woman, he runs to London, where he strikes up, does very well. He takes off, he becomes this, he spends like 20 years in London, and only, 16, 14, does he finally go back reluctantly to spend the last few years of his life with his wife in London. That's been sort of the storyline. And with that storyline in mind, people are fine to think, okay, he's a man by himself. He didn't really like his wife. He was forced into that marriage. He's a superstar writer, poet. Of course there are going to be love affairs. How glamorous. Shakespeare in Love, an example, right? Or this play. Now, first of all, let's just stop and say, marital infidelity is always bad. Always bad. I'm not just saying that because my wife is in the audience. But it was just given this sort of free range, like, it's romantic. Well, maybe not. A friend of mine, Professor Matthew Stagel, who teaches at the University of Bristol, published a very important article recently. there was this book being held in a library in North England, and in the sort of end papers of the book was a piece of old paper. And they used to recycle old paper, right? And it was glued in there, and it looked really interesting. Finally, the library allowed that piece of paper to be taken out. And it's a 16th century letter. It's a sort of legal document. It's a request for some money to be released. And it's addressed to Good Mrs. Shakespeare, Trinity Lane, London. And what Matthew has demonstrated is there were no other Shakespeares that this could have been addressed to. Right? So suddenly we have this real possibility that no, Shakespeare did not abandon his wife. No, he brought his wife, and she could read, and she was involved with his financial affairs. So the speculation that, oh, he was running around having love affairs might not be true at all. So we got to reimagine this. William and Anne together in London, in Trinity Lane, which was a very upscale little part of London. A happy married couple. In which case, isn't it slightly possible that the dark lady of the sonnets is his own wife? I throw that out there for you to hang on to. Okay, I went a little faster than I intended to. I guess we can start going to questions.
I just finished reading a book by Jodi Picoult, By Any Other Name.
Someone mentioned it to me, yeah.
She's a quote from that: Shakespeare was a jerk, that he didn't write any of those things. It was all Emilia Bassano. So interesting. And that's in the author's notes at the back. That's her feeling about Shakespeare.
Yes, someone else mentioned that novel to me. I haven't read it yet. I cannot imagine that Emilia Bassano wrote all the plays for a variety of reasons. The most important being is that Shakespeare was so deeply involved with the actors' troupes. He was part of the same acting troupe for almost 20 years. He wrote for specific actors. We know that because of some slips in the scripts and in financial documents. So it's hard to believe that a gentlewoman would be able to do that. But it's still an interesting fiction. Yeah. Other questions?
From the same book, the afterword is so beautifully written and well worth reading. And in that, part of what Jodi Picoult talks about is that if Shakespeare was a full-time actor, how did he ever have the time to write what he is purported to have written?
Okay, not necessarily that he was a full-time actor. We don't know about specific roles he plays. There's a tradition of him playing a certain number of little roles, especially old man roles, and they tend to be smaller. We know he started as an actor, but he seems to have shifted most of his attention towards writing and away from acting. So I don't buy that either. These people worked so hard, and they... Can you imagine some of the actors at Bard do it, have like 2 or 3 plays in your head that you can run out and play, right, at a moment's notice. And at the same time you're writing, but people did it in this period. And Shakespeare's not the only writer who is also an actor in this period. So, not buying that argument either. But I will read this book. Okay. Other questions?
In the play, it seems like Shakespeare is full of himself.
Yes.
He really never helps Emilia.
Yeah.
In real life, was Shakespeare that? Like, was he just didn't really care about anybody else, or what do we know?
Well, okay, we don't, but 2 things. First of all the world-famous characters that we can think of, historical figures, Shakespeare's probably the one who has the least bad said about him. Right? Seriously, right? There are a lot of historical figures out there. We can find people that hate them, right? Not with Shakespeare. And when he is described by people, the adjective that is used most often is sweet. Sweet William Shakespeare, which suggests that he was not a jerk. When I imagine Shakespeare, and I do, I imagine someone who was probably, if you met him in a room, he would probably be a bit dull. He is an observer, someone who watches humankind, watches characters, and then goes and writes them down. But he's also one of the few playwrights who doesn't end up in jail in this period. A bunch of them end up in jail because they write the wrong thing. They write something satirical. They offend a nobleman. They get into a fight and kill someone, like Ben Jonson, the playwright, who was branded on his thumb when he came very close to being hung. Nothing like that about Shakespeare. So I don't think he was a full of himself, obnoxious guy at all. But it's fun to present him this way in the play. I think it works great. And the sort of battle he has with Emilia trying to overcome that, I think it works brilliantly as a piece of drama. Don't think it's historically true.
Paul, has anybody asked you yet, what's your favorite Shakespeare play? I'm just curious.
People ask me this all the time. And I used to say, oh, it's the one I'm reading now. I think it's probably Antony and Cleopatra. For a couple of reasons. The scale of the play amazes me. Some of the poetry amazes me. And it's also about a middle-aged couple having one last sexy fling while drinking too much wine. There's just something there. I don't know. I don't know what it is. Okay.
When was it written in his career?
Antony and Cleopatra in the 17th century. So it's, so Julius Caesar's in 1699, Antony and Cleopatra is probably around 1603, 1604, something like that. Yeah. Good.
There's a small portion of the play around publishing and the difficult nature of that.
Yes.
And I saw your play, The Very Book Indeed,
yes.
last year, and I was intrigued, having seen that before seeing this, at how hard it was, especially for anyone, but especially for Emilia, if you follow that she had to go through all those lengths.
Yeah. How hard it is to get published?
To get published, yeah.
Very hard.
Yeah.
Very hard. If there are any publishers here, I have sent the play to a press. A friend of mine recommended sending it to Talon Press. I sent it to them some months ago. Have not heard a thing back. So again, if you know any publishers, call me. And we can see about getting it. Usually what the press say is the play has to have been professionally performed at least twice before they will consider it. My play was performed twice. Still can't get it. So I'm working on it. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Is it so that there's only one known picture of a contemporary drawing of Shakespeare, and several years ago there was one found in an Ontario attic or something?
Yeah.
Can you talk about those?
Yes, it's not entirely clear that any of the portraits of his, and the most famous one is the Chandos portrait, which you can see in the National Gallery in London. That's the one, immediately recognizable one. It's not entirely sure that it was painted from life. There is the etching that is in the frontispiece of the first folio, which is terrible. It looks like his head is severed, his eyes are the wrong shape. I mean, it's just terrible. That picture that was found in Ontario, interesting story. An old mentor of mine, Professor Alexander Leggett, was one of the people who was brought out to go look at this thing and make some sort of assessment. And in the end, they couldn't decide one way or the other. What was interesting about that portrait is the guy had red hair and a red beard, which we never think of Shakespeare that way, but it would have been sort of fun to think of him as a ginger.
I saw your play at BMO and then
Yes.
several times at the Freddie Wood.
Oh,
Is
thank
it coming up again at all?
Christopher. Don't know if you've scheduled 2026, but again, Okay. Other questions? Christopher.
You might think that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Any other questions?
Representing the other side of the room.
Yes, thank you.
Tell us more about the relationship between Hathaway and Shakespeare. Like, was she wealthy? Was she a patron of his to get him started?
No, the question was Anne Hathaway rich? Was she a patron? No, she came from a gentle family, though, a higher station than Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's father was, a glover, worked with his hands, so he wasn't. If you worked with your hands, you weren't a gentleman. If you had a job that did not require working with your hands, a doctor, a lawyer, or something like that, then you could be a gentleman. Or if you got a university degree, then you were a gentleman. In this play, Shakespeare eventually, and this is historically true, buys a coat of arms for the family, right? And then he can call himself a gentleman. I'm off on a tangent, by the way. The whole coat of arms things was really weird. There was this sort of registry of heraldry, and if you wanted to say, no, I come from a distinguished family, we need a coat of arms, you would pay them a bunch of money, and they would go away and say, oh, yes, we found in the records your family is descended from a wonderful line going back to Edward III, which is what Shakespeare did. So she came from a better family, and if you go and see to Stratford-upon-Avon, you can go to her family house, which is really nice. But no, there doesn't seem to be any indication that she sponsored him in any way, except maybe traveled with him to London and took care of some of the business arrangements. That letter, by the way, is weird. What it's asking Mrs. Shakespeare to do is Shakespeare owes a debt. There was a young man who was an orphan. He's just finished his apprenticeship. There is some money that's been held in trust, and now it should be given to him. And I guess it's not forthcoming. And Matthew Stegos talked to people like debt collectors and said, well, that's what you do if you're a debt collector. If the husband won't pay, you talk to the wife. All right? So good Mrs. Shakespeare, get the money, right, to this young man.
As you know, at the Bard, we've enjoyed adaptations of Shakespeare into modern settings.
Yes.
Even, Gentleman Verona.
Yep.
What about any comments on the sacrilege of modernizing the language?
Okay. Okay, here we go. This is tricky. I have absolutely no problem, and I've talked about this before, with modernizing Shakespeare, putting him in different settings, putting him in, the Okanagan, putting him in the Old West, whatever. As long as it works, you're not going to break Shakespeare. You don't want Shakespeare to be a museum piece. Now, the language thing is trickier. And I talked about this in our discussion of Much Ado, because they added language, not just changed some things, they've added language. And there was a production of Taming of the Shrew that was done here a little while back, where they moved some lines from Petruchio to Kate and back and forth. And there are other productions where they modernize the language a bit, because, okay, hoisted on my own petard. What's a petard? Yeah, it's a bomb. It's a type of small bomb. God bless you. But the audience doesn't know this. So it's a really vexed question. The other problem, of course, is so much of Shakespeare is in verse. If you start just swapping out words, you run in danger of breaking the poetry. And Shakespeare expresses a lot of the psychology of the characters through the manipulation of verse. So I guess my answer is, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. One last thought, though. Years ago, back in the 1970s, there was I forget his name now, this sort of wannabe Shakespeare scholar who sat down and translated all of Shakespeare into modern English. It's terrible. It's unreadable. So, again, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, well, shame on you. Maybe one or two more questions and then... Up, there we go.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Bridget. It's my cousin.
Two comment questions for you. One is, in the middle of the play, Dark Lady, Shakespeare makes the comment to Emilia, well, it works, it sells tickets,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. He says cheese, she says this is cheesy, he says cheese sells. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he's looking at selling a product in order to make money.
Yeah.
She's looking at art.
Yes.
So that's probably where there's a friction between them. But
Yeah.
at the end of the play,
Yeah.
when he's died and his gravestone comes up, she goes towards the grave and she starts putting stones on it. Now, we have some friends of ours who are Jewish.
Yes.
And they said this is a tradition
Yeah.
to leave stones at a grave
Yeah.
to indicate that somebody came to visit.
Yes.
So is this hypothetical, or did she actually do it, or would it have been done at that time, given the attitude towards Jewish people?
I know the tradition you're speaking of, and I've seen it in Jewish cemeteries in places like Prague and Israel, where people do that. And so that's what like I said, okay, back up. 2 questions. The evidence that she was actually Jewish is very, very circumstantial, But Jessica Hill runs with it because it makes a great story. And she has this, there's a scene where Emilia pulls out this book and says, I found it, my grandfather's Bible, when the Spanish forced him to convert. What initially caught my eye was the repetition of the name Bassano on the few pages over and over, and he practices his signature. And then I read his scribbles in the margin. My musician grandfather had translated the New Testament into Hebrew, an act of rebellion. At the back of the book, he wrote, sufferance is the badge of all our tribe. So for Jessica Hill, Jewish, absolutely Jewish. Again, Jews were banned from 1290 in England. Here's an example. At one point in Henry IV, Part 1, the character Falstaff is talking about something that's impossible, couldn't happen. He says, I would be a Jew, an Hebrew Jew, which basically saying I would be a monkey's uncle, right? Something absolutely impossible, because most people had never seen a Jew, they just knew them from myth. So if you were Jewish in London at this time, I don't think you'd be advertising yourself with stones. I don't think it would happen. Okay.
I want to think a little bit about the cutting-edge scholarship that you mentioned.
Yes.
And as I've been reflecting here, it makes me think about potential rereadings of works like James Shapiro's 1599, Year in the Life of William Shakespeare, and all of a sudden, William Shakespeare rushing to make it back from London in time in 1596 for his son's funeral. I'm rethinking that. I'm rethinking the motivation behind purchasing New Place in 1597. What are some of your initial responses to a potential paradigm shift in thinking about the familial relationship between Shakespeare and his wife, and then also that connection back to Stratford?
Well, I think it's in some ways kind of great. Let's start, first of all, why do we call Shakespeare's wife Anne Hathaway and not Anne Shakespeare? Why? Because critics have forever wanted to marginalize her, right? There's Shakespeare and there's the wife down there, right? And this rearranges this entirely and brings his wife, this woman, into this unit, and as part of his creative career. She's there helping him, doing the books or whatever. So yeah, that's a paradigm shift, and I think a pro-feminist thing. In Two Gentlemen of Verona, the guy takes off his shirt and says ally on it at one point. And what does that do with the relationship with Stratford? I don't know yet. And again, this article just came out this past year, Matthew Stegall. It's available publicly. You can download it for free. The University of Bristol has made it available. So look up Stegall, S-T-E-G-G-L-E. He's also done a couple of podcasts where he's talked about this. And he's got this great voice, Matthew. So we don't know yet, because this is so new. It showed up in the New York Times because this is such a big... So talk to me about this next year. I need time to think about it. I think we have one last question down here, and then maybe we'll call it good days. Last question, right behind Christopher.
What do you mean by manipulation of verse?
Oh, manipulation of, I've talked about this before, but the way iambic pentameter works, iambic pentameter sets up a regular beat. Oh, that is too solidly flesh should melt. Bop, 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 right? But soft will light through yonder window breaks. But then Shakespeare will break that to emphasize certain words, manipulate it to give us the character's psychology. When Hamlet says, "I shall in all my best obey you, madam," the "you" doesn't fit. So what's going on is saying, "I shall in all my best obey you, madam," not him, Claudius. So the psychology of the character is built into the manipulation of the poetic line. Wow. Oh, sorry, Christopher.
Yeah.
Last word from Christopher.
Yep, I know it's the witching hour, but Paul, I'm not often able to come, but I wanted to come today especially. I don't know how many years you've been doing this.
16.
16 years. And you and I met a number of years before that through Rafe Mayer.
Yeah.
We have our history, personal. But I, for my life, a bit like yours, have been involved heavily with Shakespeare. Was an actor, but I'm a producer now. And you are an academic, but you are so much more than that. And on behalf of myself and this massive audience that you've developed consistently, just grows and grows, and people love and respect you so much. People wonder why Bard is so successful, but you are so much part of this. You give us such insight, and so much respect is given to our company, I think based on many different things, but you are a central player. If we can do your play one day, I'd love to do it. But ladies and gentlemen, this is Paul Budra. Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.